Today, we are specifically talking to homeowners and real estate investors who own properties in coastal flood zones like this. What do you need to know here in 2024 that could have a huge impact on your wallet? So if you're a homeowner or if you're a real estate investor trying to keep as much money in your pocket and keep that profitability high on your property, then this video is for you. So let's get started. Before we do, remember, share, subscribe, like the channel so other people can find the content just like you found it. So today we're talking about coastal flood zones in 2024 and how things are changing big time. And when it comes to areas like this, coastal flood zones, what we need to understand is what is a coastal flood zone? How is it different from other flood zones? So let's briefly talk about that. So when we're talking about low risk flood zones, we're talking about things like flood zone X. These are areas the government's determined that are at a lower risk of flooding regarding maps. The trick though is 30% of claims still come out of these areas. So you don't want to get hung up on flood zones and flood maps when you're looking at flood risk. We'll talk about that a little bit later in this video. That's flood zone X. Then we've got flood zone A, or anything that begins with A. It also falls within the 100-year floodplain. It falls within that 100-year area, which is an annual chance of 1% chance of something flooding, just like this right here. Now we've talked about flood zone X, low risk, flood zone A, high risk. Now we're going to talk about coastal flood zones, also called V zones here in 2024. How are those different from A zones or X zones? Well, like A zones, they also fall within the 100-year area with that 1% annual chance of flooding probability. The big difference here is water velocity. You see, these areas usually are exposed to storm surge, like you can see right here behind me with the waves. So this means that the chances of water coming on their property actually are much higher as a result of things like hurricanes. So what can you do about this? Now, what can you do about these extremely high premiums? What can you expect in 2024 and beyond? Well, as things are changing, as people say, water is rising, more water is coming in, hurricanes are stronger, a lot of things are changing, especially with the National Flood Insurance Program, who a couple years ago actually changed where they don't even use flood zones in their rates anymore. They're using things like distance to water, the type of flooding, like you see right here behind me with storm surge, flooding frequency. I'm in an area that's been hit by 5 hurricanes the last 2 years, so the flooding frequency is much higher. All these things put together with the replacement cost of the building is what's driving up rates for the National Flood Insurance Program and private. Now the good news is that generally with the National Flood Insurance Program, the most they can increase your rates is up to 18% per year. The bad news is with private, they may non-renew you in some of these areas, especially if you're in an area that's protected by Coastal Bears Resources Act. This means that if the property was generally built or improved after the mid-80s, early 90s, that the National Flood Insurance Program doesn't even offer flood insurance in these areas. You can only get it through certain private companies. So you want to know that when purchasing one of these properties of, hey, if it's in that area, what do my options look like long-term? If I file some flood claims, I get non-renewed, am I going to be able to get coverage? Am I going to be able to sell the property? Now let's talk about what's happening with premiums. We've talked about the National Flood Insurance Program using all these things, where now in coastal areas like this, we've seen the average with the National Flood Insurance Program maybe go from $2,000 a year, closer to $3,500 to $4,000 a year. What can you do if you're purchasing a property here on the coast? One of the first things you can look at is see if the current homeowner has a policy or current investor has a policy through the National Flood Insurance Program. You might be able to take that over where it's got a grandfathered rate that's no longer available. Now, what's the big difference there? Well, you may have an $800 rate compared to someone hitting you with a $3,000 rate right away. Now, that $800 rate may eventually be $3,000, but it may take 8 years to get there. So that's one of the first things you want to ask. Then you want to look at different private options. You want to reach out to someone who specializes in flood insurance, some kind of insurance broker that has multiple options on the coast. They understand what's going on with what's called the reinsurance markets. This is basically insurance companies have to purchase to make sure claims are covered. You want to make sure they understand the volatility of that private market. Now, what you could potentially do is take a National Flood Insurance Program, get up to $250,000 in coverage, then do an excess policy, which is basically a private policy on top of your primary. It's going to give you things like additional living expenses or loss of use. This is huge as a real estate investor. Imagine this. Your property here floods on the coast and you're renting it out and you can't get rent for a year. What would that do to you financially? Well, this is where loss of use can kick in, or sometimes loss of income, where if you lose rent like this, then you may have a coverage on that private policy that helps pick up that slack for you. So you want to ask about that if you're a real estate investor. Now, if you're a homeowner, this potentially could help you pay for a hotel while your house is being prepared. We had this happen with a property owner in Nebraska. She was the only one on her block that had private flood insurance. She had a hotel paid for about 6 months while her house was being repaired. So this is where loss of use and additional living expenses can be beneficial. Remember, the National Flood Insurance Program only offers coverages up to $250,000. Here on the coast, that may not go very far. So you may need to kick in that private policy, or you may want to just take out out a private policy altogether, depending on the history of the carrier and depending on how volatile that market is. Like here in areas like Myrtle Beach, where the market is very volatile, private flood insurance options are very limited right now, just like in parts of Florida after Hurricane Ian. These are all things you want to ask your insurance agent when you're working with them. So we've talked about the National Flood Insurance Program. We talked about private. Now, if you're building one of these properties brand new, what you want to do is look at the base flood elevation or freeboarding. Freeboarding typically is the area that a community goes above the base flood elevation. Base flood elevation is the level that FEMA thinks flooding can come to. Whatever that freeboarding is, let's say that base flood's 100 feet, freeboarding is 105, we recommend building at 107. So if the flood map changes, then you may not be in this high-risk flood area. This may be an area that you can change the flood zone on when the structure is complete. So when it comes to coastal flood zones, it's important to understand all these different options with private flood insurance, the National Flood Insurance Program, what you can do to minimize your premiums. Remember, also deductibles have very minimum impact on flood insurance, and you typically have 3 separate deductibles. You're gonna have one for building, you're gonna have one for contents, and you're gonna have one for additional loss of use. Think about that when picking a building, because if you decide to pick a $5,000 deductible, you may actually have a $15,000 deductible, and you may have a rude awakening come claim time. That's what we wanted to talk about in this video when it comes to coastal flood zones like this in 2024. And I said, if you like this video, make sure to share, subscribe, and like it. Come back to the channel. You can also in the description below download our guide on flood zones to navigate through this process of getting flood insurance in these different flood zones. I'm Chris Green, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I look forward to talking to you in our next video. Thank you.